Thanks. Hi, all.
Tammy has a rich experience in ministry, including several years where she was on the leadership team at Willow Creek Community Church as well. So it's good to have Tammy with us. She also is part of the Unstuck group. Ryan Steigel. Ryan is with us. Ryan is our director of resources. He's really the smart guy on the Unstuck group team. At least he makes the rest of us look smart. Ryan's also a Cubs fan and heading to Chicago. So Ryan, good to have you with us.
Good to be here, Tony. You are outnumbered today.
I'm afraid so, yes. And then last but not least on today's panel, we have Caleb Smith. Caleb, it's Epikos Church in the Milwaukee, Wisconsin area, great church in multiple locations. And we had the privilege to work with Epikos over the last couple of years. And as we get to work with churches across the country, we of course identify some churches that are really healthy, moving in a healthy direction, and that's primarily the reason why Caleb's a part of the conversation today, is we uncovered some great things happening at Epikos Church. And so Caleb, welcome to the conversation today. It's good to have you.
Thanks. It's good to be here. Appreciate the opportunity to share with everybody.
In the background, we have some folks supporting us, including Mark Morgan. Mark, we share the same last name, Morgan, but we're unrelated. It's interesting, though. I'll follow him to consulting engagements as we're working with churches. He's trying to convince them that I'm his father. This is not true if he ever does this with you. But Mark's here today because we have a Q&A happening throughout the process. At the bottom of your screen, there should be an opportunity for you to submit questions that you have. Mark may be responding to some of those directly through the chat. And he'll be providing some of those to me so that at the end of our conversation this afternoon, we can take a few moments to answer your questions. And trust me, if we don't get to your questions, we'll try to unpack those in future conversations as we engage that discussion online and social media. In fact, speaking of social media, we'd love for you to participate in the dialogue, Twitter, Facebook, wherever your heart takes you. Use the hashtag #ChurchVitalSigns, Church Vital Signs. So this is where we're going today. We're going to be hitting 4 kind of key questions. We're going to look at, first of all, why is it that we need a deeper set of metrics in ministry? Secondly, we'll be looking at how to know who you're really reaching on Sunday mornings. The third topic that we're going to hit is how to tell if your connection process is working. And then finally, this afternoon, we're going to look at how growing churches do more ministry with less staff. And then, like I said, continue to ask questions using the chat feature throughout this process. At the end of the conversation, after we've hit those 4 topics, we'll circle back and try to address as many questions as possible. But let's start. The first question is, why do metrics matter in ministry? And Blake, actually, I want to turn to you first.
Okay.
You've consulted with a number of pastors through the years, and I'm just curious, why do you think it is that attendance consumes so much of our thinking?
That's a great question. First of all, thanks for having me. It's a great honor to start a dialogue that sort of orbits around meaningful metrics. And the first thing that I'd like to acknowledge is there's probably a billion reasons why pastors are consumed with church attendance. Reasons like attendance, it tends to get us and our church's attention. It tends to get us noticed. However, I think at the core that we've somehow built and have believed this misconception that success equals large attendance numbers. So we obsess over how many people attend our gatherings because at the end of the day, every single one of us, we have this desire to be successful. And there's nothing wrong with the desire to see our churches grow. But when it becomes an obsession, I think it causes us to lose focus on the stuff that really matters. I'll be the first to admit to you that attendance, man, it matters. And attendance matters a great deal. It matters a whole lot. However, attendance should be viewed as merely a byproduct of a healthy church. It's a byproduct of a healthy culture and team. It's a byproduct of a very intentional discipleship path. And I hope that this webinar, it gives you the permission to focus on what matters and place attendance in its proper place. It should be a byproduct. Do what matters, and attendance will take care of itself. And move away from this very unhealthy obsession that we have of, man, we've got to pack out this room, and that becomes our focal point, and it distracts us from building the stuff that truly matters, that's going to result in our church growing, if that makes sense.
It sure does. Yeah, I appreciate your heart there, Blake. And like you, I don't think attendance is something we should ignore by any means, but
Sure.
It's not the sole measure of church health. And so that's why with attendance, we look at a number of other areas. In fact, part of the ministry health assessment that the Unstuck Group does with churches that we serve is we provide the vital signs report. And Caleb, perfect example with Epicos, that was one of the first steps we engaged with your team, providing that vital signs report, and I think probably 14, 15 different metrics that we provided. And I'm curious, when your team received that, what clarity did that bring to your team as you began to review all the different metrics?
Yeah, absolutely. So it really does fall into two things. One, it was like there were a few things that were surprising to us and just helped to give more definition to what we were seeing. And then there were those things that we said, yeah, you know what, this actually is just confirming for us that we're doing what we expected, or the numbers are coming out as we expected them to. And so it challenged us in certain ways, or it helped encourage us as to what was happening. So like some of those things that were surprising was that the giving, that not so much that the giving average was where it was at, but that we saw what that meant within our whole budget of actually. It was surprising how many people then were giving. We as a 12-year-old church, we were really beginning to get right on the cusp of needing to get better at our financial metrics. And so one of those was then entering in a season of just thankfulness of how many people were giving and what we were seeing in that. Because a lot of people, at least here in our context, they just give by cash that they drop in the bucket. There's not a lot that we can track in terms of online or texting giving or anything like that. So that was an encouraging piece. We were surprised by our volunteer numbers and our staffing numbers. And the surprising thing was not that we didn't know how many, it was then being able to see where that fell in comparison to other churches that you all had worked with and what you all had been seeing across the country. And that was the surprising piece, finding where we were low or where we were on the high end and what that meant for us and our culture. And then I'd say a couple things that just helped to give us encouragement were our small groups, how many adults we had in small groups. And again, it's the comparison piece. So what that looked like compared to the other churches that you guys had worked with at that time. And the ratio of children and teens was a big thing for us. It actually, especially with our teenage ministry, our student ministry, it gave us even more of an impetus and a drive to go out and hire a full-time youth pastor. We saw what that metric was at. It was very low for who we were at the time, and we then realized it's this low. We have hundreds, if not thousands, of teens in the communities around our 3 campuses. So what do we need to do to address that? And that gave us a lot of momentum to go out and hire a great youth pastor.
That's great. Yeah, I love the additional insights that the different vital signs help us with, so that we can not only ascertain where are we today, but help us make decisions about moving forward. But I know for some of you, numbers are just a little bit frightening. In fact, I've had a couple of pastors along the way say, I've been a part of ministries that focus too much on numbers, and because of that, in our church, we're not going to pay attention to the numbers. And I just want to challenge you a little bit on that. You're right. If that's what you're thinking today, I've seen some, I would consider, unhealthy environments where the sole focus was just the numbers. And you can almost manipulate the numbers to say what you want. And so I encourage churches like that. Let's figure out what those healthy vital signs are that you're going to monitor. But to complement that, there needs to be a way for you to make sure you're capturing stories from within your church, the stories of life change that are happening. And that's important because it'll be those stories that you hear over time that will help confirm that the numbers are accurate, that the numbers are pointing out those areas of our ministry where there are health and where there are opportunities for us to make improvement. But the flip is true as well. If we only are trying to hear the stories in our ministry and ignoring any monitoring of numbers of those vital signs in our ministry, if we do that, the risk is this. It's really impossible to at any moment in time hear everybody's story that our ministry is impacting. And because of that, our tendency is to wait, to really pay attention to the last conversation we had. If that conversation was good, we feel like the ministry is healthy. If that last conversation was negative, we're challenged by that. And so it's good to capture those stories, but the numbers will help us confirm what the stories are telling us as well. So we need both. Now, the churches that do a good job, I think, of identifying what their vital signs are, these are some of the benefits they'll see. First, this is one way that we can bring the whole team to the same page moving forward. It's kind of like an athletic team. You're monitoring the scoreboard and everybody knows if we're winning or losing. And then with that, we know how to pull together as a team so that we can move forward and try to get the victory. Second thing is it highlights what God's doing, and that's a good thing. We should take time to celebrate the life change that's happening in our ministry. And one way for us to identify that is to monitor the vital signs, the next steps that we're seeing in our ministry. The other thing it can do is it can help to expose some of the core issues that we're wrestling with as a ministry. It can shine the spotlight on some areas that need improvement, where we need to bring clarity, where we may need to complement what we're already doing. These are the areas that once we as a team can identify what the issues are, again, we can begin to work together, pull together to take our next steps forward. The other thing is it really confirms for us, are we making progress? In that way, as we make changes, as we take new ground, as we make new steps, take next steps, we can identify, are we actually seeing benefit from the changes that we've made? And so we have a probe that we can just make sure the changes are actually producing health. So that's a little bit about the first question, why are the metrics important to us? Let's turn our attention to the second topic, looking specifically at attendance, and kind of answering the question, what can attendance tell us about who we're trying to reach? And how can we dive a little bit deeper beyond just the attendance numbers to get to more specifics? And Ryan, I want to turn to you here first. How can metrics tell us who we are reaching?
Well, thanks, Tony. As Caleb alluded, one of the things we do at the Unstuck Group is when we engage with the church, we help them take information that they already have and understand it at a deeper level and get a better sense of their congregation's health. And one of the big ways we do that is by helping them identify not just how many people they're reaching on the weekend, but exactly or more clearly who they're reaching. And there are a few different groups that we hear a lot of pastors talking about in the conversations that we have with them, specific groups that they feel like they are working to reach through their church and through their services. One of those groups is simply new guests. And you can see here on the slide, we help churches really understand how well they're doing at reaching new people and just being outward focused by looking at their guest to attendance ratio. That guest to attendance ratio is simply the number of guests that a church sees in a 12-month span divided by its average attendance at the church. So you'll see here the top 10% of churches that we've worked with, the kind of that top tier, that upper crust, are seeing 1.13 guests every year for every one person in average attendance. Your average range there, obviously, you see there is 0.56 to 0.69, but the churches that are really effective in this area are hitting that 1.13 number there. But there's another group that pastors are constantly looking to reach, and that's unchurched people. right? We all want to reach unchurched people. We want to make sure that we're growing our churches, not just through transfer growth, but through conversion growth as we're introducing people into a relationship with Christ. And we look very closely at the baptism number for that church. Some churches will track salvations. We intentionally choose baptisms because we feel like baptism shows kind of a deeper level of commitment. I can't tell you how many times growing up that I raised my hand to get saved, right? I was doing a pastor a great favor if he was looking at a salvation metric, right? But we look at baptisms because typically you're only going to get baptized one time. And that really helps us get clarity and certainty about how well a church is doing at reaching unchurched people. And on average, you'll see there churches are reaching or baptizing about 6 to 7% of their average weekend attendance. Those upper kind of top 10% churches are baptizing 11% of their average attendance, on the weekend. So that's that unchurched people group that we all really want to focus on and reach. But then there's a third group that's kind of been on the conversation cusp over the past probably 5 years. And that's millennials that now really have become young families. And for churches that are having the millennials conversation and really trying to reach that generation, this is a generation that is now having kids and beginning to start young families. And this percentage of kids ratio gives you a really clear indicator of how well you're doing at reaching that generation. A lot of times we look at the kids percentage metric. A lot of times pastors will look at that as an indication of how well their children's ministry is doing, or an indication of how well their children's pastor is doing. And yes, that certainly is a part of it, but the kids are only getting there if their parents are driving them and want to be a part of the church as well. And so that percentage of kids metric, we really believe is a metric that the entire church owns as it's working to reach young families. So when we break it down, this just helps us to get better clarity about not just how many people we're reaching on the weekend, but exactly who we are reaching and open our eyes to how we may need to reach them better.
That's good. Hey, Tiffany, can you bring that slide back for a second? Because I want to ask Ryan about something, to ask him if I'm thinking about this correctly. In fact, one of the questions that's come up recently from the podcast that I did with Carrie Newhoff recently was about front door versus back door. And I think one way, Ryan, you can help me confirm this, that we can monitor that is by looking at this guest to attendance ratio. In other words, if overall attendance is flat or declining and the number of new guests is below average, that would suggest to me it's more of a front door problem. The church isn't getting enough guests coming in kind of experiencing for the first time, or people aren't connecting in those very first steps to what's happening at the church. Is that a good read on my part, Ryan?
Absolutely, Tony. Absolutely. And the inverse is also true. If you've got a large number of guests coming into the church, but your attendance is in decline, usually we'd look at that attendance and decline metric and initially just say, well, we're not reaching new people. But we've had situations with churches where their attendance is in decline, but their guest to attendance metric is very high. And when they see that, they realize we're not having trouble getting new people into our church, but what we're providing them is certainly not effective. And we're definitely not getting them connected into the congregation.
Right. And that becomes either an assimilation conversation or it's the backdoor conversation at that point. How do we get people on a discipleship path so they're connecting in relationship and Bible engagement and all the other things that we're doing to encourage people to take their next steps toward Christ? All right, good work there, Ryan. Ryan, like me, is a bit of a numbers nerd. He actually likes spreadsheets. I know we're weird people. That's why I enjoy having Ryan in these conversations. So Blake, when we were working with Mountain Lake Church, where you were for several years, one of the numbers that really jumped out to us was the baptism number. Ryan was just referring to that in the previous chart, but at Mountain Lake, you guys were kind of off the charts there. Just the number of people that you're baptizing. And I'm curious, from your perspective, what was unique about what was happening at Mountain Lake that this was such a strong, healthy number for you?
Yeah, I think it all started with the group of people that we were trying to reach. At Mountain Lake, we would say this from the platform constantly, is that we exist for those who are not yet with us. And if you were to drill down a bit deeper on that, you would discover that we existed for those who were unchurched, for those who didn't know Christ. So everything that we said and or did at Mountain Lake had that particular demographic in mind. So it governed our language, our worship gatherings, our groups, all of that. Connected to that, we had a very methodical and intentional process as it related to baptism that started with us talking about it and talking about it a lot from the platform. We made it very clear to people that baptism was the next step after they made the decision to make Jesus leader and forgiver. We made it very easy for people to express interest through what we called a communication card that we made available in every worship gathering. From there, the individual wanting to be baptized was placed in a process queue, and the process queues was housed inside of our church management software that we had called CCB. And it took them through all of the necessary steps that they needed to take before going public with their faith. Mm-hmm. A very simple question, it's not rocket science, but a very simple question that we asked at Mountain Lake that was kind of the governing question for all of our processes was, what's next? Okay, so they expressed interest in baptism. What's next? They were entered into a process queue by our admin team. Okay, what's next? They got a phone call from one of our pastors explaining the importance of baptism and its meaning. What's next? They were scheduled to be baptized or to be put on the baptism calendar, so on and so forth. What I think makes a great process, especially when it comes to a baptism process, is it always begins with the end in mind. We knew we wanted to baptize at least 10% of our church attendance every year. And sometimes we got a little bit higher than that. So we began with what we wanted to see happen. We wanted to see 10% of our total church attendance go public with their faith through baptism. So in order for that to happen, all of these steps and processes needed to take place. None of this happened, and it won't happen inside of your church by accident. It takes intentionality. And so, our methodical process that we had employed and deployed inside of our church really enabled us to baptize, a great deal of people that didn't know Christ.
That's great. And I love that you're connecting, kind of setting some prayer goals for the church with intentional processes to complement that, to support that. That's pretty powerful. All right, Tammy, I want to invite you into the conversation here. As I mentioned up front, Tammy's a pastor of creative arts at Christ Community Church in the Chicagoland area. Tammy, one of the big challenges, and you know this well, when we're working with churches, particularly in the health assessments that we do with churches, is many times we identify they've become inward focused. And so both from your perspective as a consultant with the Unstuck Group, and then in your role as pastor of creative arts, help us think about how we design weekend services to keep outsiders in mind. These first stats about who we're reaching. Mm-hmm. So how can we be healthier in this area?
Yeah, so not only do I have the opportunity to help lead weekend services across our 4 campuses at Christ Community Church, but like you said, I help do the health assessments for the Unstuck Group. So health assessments are just basically weekend visits where we come visit you for a weekend, and then you look at your church weekend services through the lens of a guest. So, some of the things that I'm looking at when I'm coming up to a church or looking at my own churches, it starts way outside of the actual service. Is when I'm pulling into a church parking lot, I'm looking for things like easy signage that we're not making it difficult for people to just figure out where the kids area is or where the auditorium is. And then just I'm looking at how I'm greeted, even in the parking lot. Like, are there parking attendants that are not just helping me park my car, but they're kind of friendly and they're smiling or they're high-fiving kids, and they're just creating some dynamic environment that would make me as a guest feel like, oh, this is kind of a fun place to be. And then just with, eyes wide open, walking on up to the building, I'm kind of looking at the overall cleanliness. Like, is there trash laying around? Is there spots on the carpet? Are the bathrooms clean or are they smelly? Because if I'm a parent, if I'm a new attender, and I'm a parent, I might think that an uncared for facility might equate for, you're probably not going to take care of my kids very well either. And sometimes when we're in our churches, we just get immune to things. Things are around us and we don't see them anymore. So I would challenge you to look at those kind of things just through the lens of a guest. And it doesn't have to be, things don't have to be expensive or fancy. It's just like, take care of what you have. And then just, walking on into the weekend services, we all know that language matters, but really, pay attention to that. Like, for instance, a worship pastor, maybe they're doing a transition and they're setting up the teaching and they're saying, hey, this week we're going to talk about the Gospel of Mark. Well, if I'm an attender, I might say, what's the gospel and who is Mark? So then just one more line to that. The gospel is the story of Jesus, and Mark is one of the books in the New Testament of the Bible. Just one more level of explanation, it takes like 10 seconds, will make me connected if I'm somebody just exploring faith and don't already have a faith background. So, and then, there's music and sound and light. So music, it's just figure out what your brand is and what your target is. So for us, from where I'm at, Christ Community Church, we have kind of several key things that we're looking at when we're choosing songs. We happen to choose these 3 metrics that we're looking at, or 3 qualifiers. We're looking at their theological content. We're looking at, do they somewhat theme to the service? And then we're looking for singability, because sometimes the worship team picks songs that are like great songs, but they're all over the place as far as singing, and they can sing them great, but the people in the congregation has a really difficult time, with the language. So those are 3 of the things that we're always looking at when we're choosing music. And then just even, we use sound and lights, and we use a pretty robust light system. We use moving lights and colored lights, and for us, it's all about creating beauty in the services, but not distraction. So you got to kind of take a look at that. If you're using lights and you happen to choose to use moving lights, is it adding value to the service, or is it maybe kind of pulling these people out of the service, especially if somebody's not used to being a regular attender of the church? And the same with sound. We know what our brand is for sound. We know what decibel level that we're trying to hit every week. We know we want a robust sound, but we don't want, we want to be able to hear the vocals and the individual instruments, not a wall of noise. So that varies. The whole sound, music, what happens in the auditorium varies a lot, but it's just like, figure it out for your church, what it is, and then kind of stick close to the brand there. Have a reason for doing what you do. So those are some things we're looking at when we're doing health assessments.
That's good stuff. And Tammy, I love it when you're going out to churches, because you have so much experience working with some great churches, and the insights that you pull out from that kind of secret shopper experience are always so helpful. So I appreciate your work there. But let's turn the corner. Let's talk about this next question. How can we tell if the connection process, those next steps, are actually happening? And Ryan, again, I want to begin with you. To help us unpack what are some of the vital signs that we can be looking for here to make sure people are taking their next steps.
Yeah, so this is really that backdoor question to complement the front door question we had a few minutes ago. And there are 2 major next steps that most churches are leading people towards as they're engaging them in some type of discipleship pathway. The first one of those steps is small groups or studies for some churches. And what we see in the average of churches that we work with is that they have a participation rate in small groups of 53 to 64%. But those churches that are at that top 10%, who are really connecting people really, really well, they're connecting people at a level of about 91%. So that's 91% of adults and students within the church engaged in small groups. So that's that small group step. But then we also look at that volunteer step, just that percent of people who are using their gifts to serve and live outside of themselves on the team, serving at least one time a month. The average there we see at 40 to 49%, but they're the top 10% of churches. They're really connecting people to serving opportunities well, are connecting about 71% of their average attendance into a volunteer team. One thing to note here, Tony, I know it's dear to your heart and our teams as well, is that when we run these metrics here for next steps, we look at both adults and students. You'll notice that both of those groups are rolled together. So that's students grades 6 through 12 and adults. And the reason we do that is we really believe that we should be engaging students in discipleship next steps, just like we're engaging adults in next steps, right? We don't want to wait until they graduate high school to then begin engaging them in some type of discipleship pathway. Now, their connection process may look a little bit different, right, as they're working with their student leaders there. But it's very important to us that we begin engaging the next generation into a discipleship pathway and help them get connected within the church, so that when they complete their time in student ministries, right, they still have this connection to the body of Christ through both small groups and volunteer teams.
Yeah, and Ryan, that's probably a bit of a personal bias, but I've just seen with my kids that the quality of the gathering, that's important, but what keeps them coming back is the relational connection that they have with their peers, and the opportunity to use their gifts too. Go figure. Young adults are very similar to older adults. You get them in a relationship, you let them use their gifts, they're more likely to stay engaged and connected in the ministry. So that's one of the reasons why we always look at not just the adult numbers, but the young adult numbers, the student numbers, and that as well. So Blake, I know you have a lot of experience through the years working with some churches that have really they're not only just trying to gather as many people as they can for weekend services. That's a good thing. But then also encouraging them to take a next step beyond the weekend. And what are you seeing that's working in this area, Blake?
Well, like some of the things that we did at Mountain Lake, some of the things that we're doing here at Three Circle Church is getting a grasp on what our community, what our primary customer values, and then leaning into that. For instance, at Mountain Lake, we knew that the demographic we were trying to reach, which was the unchurched, those who didn't know Jesus, that they had a high premium on community. That's what they valued. And so we made the call to spend an immense amount of effort and energy in building a really healthy small group culture. We had almost 70% of our total church attendance that were involved in groups. We knew that that group of people also were very much cause driven, that was a value. So we started serve days and promoted it as get off the couch events inside of our small groups. We started a food distribution partnership with a local food bank. We started a World Care program, which would be our missions department that consisted of both local and global engagement. We built our message series around their felt needs and snapped events and missional components onto that. So it wasn't just a message that made them feel good or that was quality. We gave them application points to connect throughout the week. I think getting people connected behind the weekend is figuring out what they wholesomely value, because obviously they have some societal values that are not very biblical, so figuring out, what do they value that's wholesome, that's meaningful, that's powerful, and then leaning into those values. And a byproduct of this will be getting your people connected outside of the worship gatherings. And so, that's just sort of the filter that I think through when I'm trying to get people connected outside of the context of just the worship experience.
That's good. And Caleb, this is one of those areas that, again, I think this is a strength for Epikos. And I thought fascinating when I was engaging with your team that you're monitoring a whole set of these vital signs, but at the top of the list is not attendance for your church. It's actually small group engagement. Share a little bit about that. Why is that the case?
Small groups is the lifeblood of what we do here. And a lot of that was born out of what we saw as a part of the faith context in the Milwaukee area, and how that had developed over the decades. And so when our founding and lead pastor, Danny Parmalee, planted the church, his innate passion was to see small groups happen. The church started as a small group in his living room, and simply continued as the main function of what we were doing. We see that as really the clear step in what it means to be a disciple, and some of that is based out of a regular attendance average. We see all of these statistics that are saying that people are attending church a little less than 2 times a month now. Here at Epikos, our best guess is a little over 2 times a month, but within that, we look at our small group attendance and our small group involvement, I should say, because those meet every single week, and the people who are in those groups, they go almost every single week. If they may miss Sunday, but they will not miss their small group. And so for us, we see that as a key sign of how we're doing. How are things growing? How many people do we have that are in groups that are also being mentored by their group leader to be a group leader for the next year, and looking to continually grow those.
Yeah, again, I love the intentionality and the priority you have around that. It's not just the small groups pastor that's concerned about that. It's your whole team is focused on that, beginning with your senior pastor. And actually, Ryan, that kind of brings me to you on this topic, continuing to focus on small groups. Well, let me back up for a second. Everybody that's participating today, the good news is Ryan and I have been working together with our team on updating vital signs. So it's been 2 years since we
Sure.
released the first version of that. Everybody that's participating in the webinar today, I'll share more at the end and you'll get an email about this. You're going to get first access to the updated version that includes all the new data. But one of the other new elements with this version of Vital Signs, this new version, is Ryan, you did some legwork and you helped us identify the top 10% churches in a number of these Vital Signs areas, one of them being small groups. And in those conversations with the top 10% churches, you found some trends when it comes to small groups. Can you unpack that a little bit?
Absolutely. It's really interesting when you start kind of segmenting out that top 10% and dialoguing with those pastors, hearing the same themes throughout multiple conversations there. And in the conversation with those pastors of top 10% kind of engagement in small groups, there were three core themes that really emerged in those conversations. One of those themes was that these churches really have systems that equip. And what I mean by that is when they say they do small groups, they don't just stop there. They don't just say, well, we do small groups. They have a very clear plan and system for not just doing small groups, but to clarify how they do small groups. So they know what small groups means for them specifically, because there's many, many ways to do it, right? And they know what it requires of a leader to lead a small group at their church specifically. And then they provide those leaders with the systems that they need to be very easily equipped to lead a small group successfully. So it's very easy for them to engage a new leader, to recruit a new leader, to train them on how to lead a small group well, and very quickly mobilize him or her to start a new group and to establish that community. So they have very clear systems that equip. They know how they do small groups. The second thing, though, that was a theme in those conversations was that these top 10% churches really have a simplified model around small groups. So small groups for them aren't one of the things that they do. And they will say it as clearly as small groups are the thing that we do. We don't do anything else, and we protect them very, very closely. So they don't have competing ministries, right? They don't have a plethora of other next steps that they're encouraging people towards on a regular basis. They do small groups. They believe in the power of community to help people grow in their relationship with Christ. And they leverage all their resources to getting people connected to that. So that was that second theme. The third theme, though, that we see with that is that they have very strategic on-ramps to getting people involved with small groups. So they have very clear times throughout the year. You talk with these pastors, and they know when in the year they're going to promote small groups. And what's very interesting to me is that these lead pastors take personal responsibility for getting people connected to groups. They're not looking at their assimilation team. They're not looking at their discipleship pastor and saying it's his or her job to get people connected. These pastors are making it their responsibility. They're platforming small groups heavily on the weekends, and they're blocking out specific portions of their calendar throughout the year to provide those strategic on-ramps to help people very easily get involved with groups. So they know how they do groups, right? They have a clear system for doing those groups. They have simplified their model around small groups, and they create very strategic on-ramps to promote those groups and get people involved. And that's why they're reaching kind of that top 10% and connecting people into community.
That's good stuff. And several people have heard me say it before. I don't know who this quote's original to, but I believe it. Hope is not a strategy. And in each of these areas, each of these Vital Signs areas, I've never found a church that is unhealthy in one of these areas and they just drift towards health magically. That doesn't happen. Most churches have to take intentional next steps to get to a healthy place. And those things that you highlighted, Ryan, are great examples of what churches are doing intentionally to get healthy when it comes to small group connections. But let's turn the corner again. This last area we wanted to talk about, and I know, there's more than a few hundred people on the webinar today. I'm guessing most of them are probably paid to be watching this webinar today. In other words, they're on staff. And so one of the common areas that churches are curious about are some vital signs around staffing in churches. And so can you unpack for us how we look at this?
Absolutely. It's funny in conversation with pastors, I've never heard a pastor say that he needed less staff at his church. Right? We all feel the need to have more staff and more of the right people involved. But one of the things that we do look at to get a healthy sense of the congregation and of the church is their attendance to staff ratio. So how many, basically this is asking for every one full-time equivalent on our staff, how many congregation members or members do we have in average attendance? I should say. So to break this down, you'll see here the top 10% churches in this attendance to staff ratio have 121 people in average attendance for every one full-time equivalent on their staff. And we really encourage, Tony, churches to reach that 100-to-1 ratio at a minimum. We really feel like it's a stretch for a lot of churches, but it helps them focus on building volunteer teams and engaging people in the work of ministry and moving ministry into the congregation rather than just relying on paid staff to do that. But that attendance to staff ratio is a big one for us as we're getting a sense of how healthy the staff is versus the volunteer engagement that they have at the church.
That's good. That's good. And just for those of us that are challenged when it comes to the math on this, Ryan, you used the term full-time equivalent. What does that mean?
Yeah, absolutely. So full-time equivalent is basically looking at the, on average, the number of 40-hour employees you have at the church. The way that you would calculate that, and I'll preface with this, we're going to provide a resource at the end that is going to basically do all of the calculations for you. So if you're a church leader who doesn't love numbers, right, doesn't geek out like Tony and I when they see a spreadsheet, we are going to take all of the legwork off your plate for this. So we'll share that with you here in just a few moments. But that full-time equivalence number, if you were to take the number of hours worked by the part-time staff at your church and divide that by 40 and add that number to your full-time staff, that would be the number of full-time equivalents that you have on your payroll.
That's good. Okay, very good. And by the way, here too, we're talking about all staff, not just pastors and directors and ministry staff. This is looking at all staff. And Tammy, some of the churches are going to look at that data and find themselves in the below category. They're below average or they're average. I always challenge the more competitive churches that I get to serve. Do you really want to just settle for being average here? Wouldn't you like to be above average in this category? But for the churches that sense a bit of tension around this conversation about staff to attendance ratio, help guide them or point them in a better, healthier direction.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with just their hiring practices, and are they hiring the right people? Are they hiring people who are, equippers of ministry? Or, a lot of times I visit churches, there's just so many doers of ministry. They've hired lots and lots of doers, and that's where the staff numbers get off balance and things. So I'll share with you my two favorite all-time questions that I ask when I'm interviewing people that to me tells me a whole lot about them. And they're kind of odd questions. But the first one is, think about a job that you've greatly enjoyed and tell me what it was that you valued the most. And then you just shut up. And what they'll do is the person on the other end, they'll sometimes like, well, value the most, what do you mean? You said, whatever you want to share, about that. A leader knows how to answer that question. And you listen to what they say. What do they really value? And is there something that's coming out in that in, developing people? Or are they talking about, I valued that job where I, only had to work 30 hours a week and I was paid for 40, or, what are they talking about as they're saying that? So you just let them talk and talk and talk as much as they can. It's an intentionally vague question. Which will throw some people off. But again, a leader knows how to answer that, and it's intentionally open-ended. So just let them talk on that for a while, and then you ask them the reverse of that is like, think about a job that you didn't enjoy and tell me what it was that you didn't like about that role. If you listen closely, that will tell you a whole lot about the person, because everybody that you're interviewing they know how to answer the right questions if you're just asking them routine questions. But when you ask them kind of vague and fuzzy things, you learn a lot about the person. And then, if you are considering bringing new people onto your team, you do want to look and dig into their past record of performance and things, but dig deep. Like if somebody says, well, I helped the church grow from 10 people or 10 small groups to 50 small groups. Dig into that. Like, how did they do that? Because you want to make sure that they really were a strategic part of that, and not that they just had a great team around them and it just happened to happen. Like they were in the right spot at the right time, but maybe they didn't really have anything to do with that. So really dig into the how did they do that to make sure that they know how to recreate that. And the other thing that I will throw out real quickly, just with staffing is thing, and I'm just more and more impressed with this all the time, is that culture really matters, culture fit. And just quick story. So I was talking to this guy a while back. He was part of a a church for a number of years, Church A, and just really had a great, track record. So, some of the things that was on his performance evaluation that he had was like attention to detail, bias for action, passion and energy. I mean, bottom line, he was an A, rock star ministry director. He had to move somewhere else because he had to relocate to closer to where his parents were.
Mm-hmm.
And so this same guy, a year later, in a similar sized church, on paper looks totally similar churches, he got feedback like micromanagement, moves too quickly, emotional in meetings. And so like in one place, what was attention to detail was micromanagement, and the other. So it's looking through a different lens. Both churches were really great churches. So, even if you're looking at your current staff, or if you're looking at adding staff on, making sure that you're getting people who really do fit into the flow of the culture. Different is good sometimes, but too different may not be good. So, a few thoughts.
Yeah, and thanks for not sharing my name when you were telling that story, Tammy. Appreciate that. Well, let's talk about next steps here. I just mentioned a little bit earlier the Vital Signs ebook, brand new version. And Ryan, I want to have you help me highlight some of the new features. But we're going to unpack 14 different Vital Signs metrics for you in this. And so it's fresh data. I mentioned new stories around what the top 10% churches are doing. Ryan, any other highlights you want to share about the new ebook?
Yeah, Tony, I'm really excited to share this. I know a lot of our team is. The number of churches this is based on, we've actually worked with over 200 churches now and based all of the information in this resource on our experience with those churches and on clear information and clear data that is apples to apples with those churches. It's hard to get clear apples to apples information about churches across the country. And we've been able to do that and capture that here on over 200 churches that we've worked with. Plenty of stories. If you're not a numbers person, there are tons of great stories about what the top 10% of churches are doing differently. And I walked away inspired just reading through the comments and the insights that these lead pastors were able to provide us. And I think you're really going to enjoy those. There's also a free resource in there, as you alluded. You may be highlighting this next, but there's a resource included with that. I'll let you highlight that.
So free webinar. We didn't charge you for this. I think we should give them the ebook too for free.
Absolutely.
Okay with that, Ryan? Okay. So all the royalties that you were hoping to get, I'm sorry. We're going to give you a free ebook. And then included in that, Ryan was just mentioning this, is another free resource. It's the Vital Signs Report. Normally we charge a couple $100 for churches to do that. We're just going to give you that for free too. So all of that is free just because you took this time to engage the conversation with us today. We're grateful for that. In fact, we're going to get to some of your questions here too in a moment. But the other next step I want to offer is Tammy and I and a couple of us were alluding to this ministry health assessment that the Unstuck Group offers. It's really one of 3 key steps that we walk churches through. It's the first step, though. We want to understand what's healthy in the church and where are the core issues or the opportunities to take some next steps. And it's a pretty engaging process. There's a secret shopper visit included in this. We'll talk with your staff leadership. If you want us to engage with your lay leadership board, we'll do that as well. But we're just trying to bring fresh eyes to your church. And good news here is we understand there are churches all different sizes. And so the Unstuck Group, one of the ways that we're helping churches of all different sizes is just acknowledging, particularly for the smaller churches, you can't afford to pay for the health assessment what some of the larger churches do. And so we'll accommodate you based on the size of your church. We just want to make sure every church has an opportunity for this on-site ministry health assessment. So for those of you who want to go a step further from what you can learn from Vital Signs, we'd love to take that next step for you as well. And you can learn more about that at theunstuckgroup.com. All right, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to look at, scroll through chat. Mark, if you can help, if you're listening in the background, if you can help shoot me some highlights. But I'm going to scroll through and try to grab some of these questions here. All right, so let me let's see. Okay, this is from Lisa. Ryan, I think I'm going to need your help on this one. her question's this: our percentage is 55% in small groups. All right, so as I recall, that's in the kind of the average category. So her question is this, though: we're not developing leaders well. So they're having a challenge getting new leaders on board. And so kind of asking, what do we do to take the next step when it comes not just to getting people in groups, but developing the leadership to support the groups? Any best practices that you are seeing as you engage with churches around that topic?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things, and we alluded to this earlier, but I think one of the questions I would ask in that situation is how easy is it for a new leader to get engaged? I know when I get recruited for anything, my initial question is, what is this going to require of me? Because I'm working full time and I've got a family and I've got the things that I do on the side, right? And so to add one more thing on my plate immediately, it's just kind of the answer is no, especially those individuals who are high capacity leaders that we often target for leadership roles. These are people, we know they're leaders because they're already leading in some area of life, which means they're already very busy. And so I think one of the key things there is just clarifying, okay, how do we on-ramp leaders and how do we set up, like we talked about earlier, a system that equips so that we can bring on new leaders, make it very clear from the beginning, hey, you can do this and it's not going to require a ton of you, but the gifts that you already have within you. I think that's a key thing in recruiting small group leaders, and just keeping it on the forefront of the church. Just that lead pastor talking about small groups and the value of it to the congregation on a regular basis just makes people want to be a part of it more and understand the important role that they play in the body of Christ when they do step forward to become a group leader.
Yeah. And by the way, that's one of the vital signs. We can't cover all the vital signs in this ebook resource that you'll be receiving. But several of the churches that I work with, they understand that leadership is a vital sign for the health of their church. And so they will set targets and really put together some intentional strategy of recruiting and developing leaders. Just had this conversation just yesterday with a couple of churches, and we were talking about, if we added up all the people in our groups ministry and are serving at ministry teams, what would be a healthy span of care? And we basically said we would want to make sure there's one leader for every 5 people that are volunteering or in a group. So that may be a barometer that you would begin to use to track, do we have enough leaders to sustain a healthy ministry? Blake, I want to go to you with this question. We had several people ask about tracking first-time guests. Are there specific ways that your churches have been doing this, that you're seeing that they're trying to capture the number of guests that are actually attending services?
Well, yeah, I think that one of the things that first-time guests want to do, this is kind of what I'm seeing here at Three Circle Church and what we saw at Mountain Lake, and I think it's probably church-wide, is that they want to attend your church anonymously a lot of the times. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that we did at Mountain Lake is we required everybody every single weekend to fill out a communication card. Mm-hmm. And that way it wasn't, hey, if you're a first-time guest, reach into the seat back and you're kind of awkwardly reaching and nobody else is. And so in order to have the participation of those that are attending our church for the first time, we would stand up on the platform and say, hey, if you are a Mountain Laker, you lead the way, grab this communication card, begin to fill that out. This is something that we fill out every single weekend around here. And so we would see that our first-time guests would just follow suit. Everybody else is doing it. They kind of felt the peer pressure there, and they would pull that card out. And we had a spot on the communication card where they could say, I'm a first-time guest, I'm a second-time guest, I'm a third-time guest. And so from there, we would actually take that information and turn it over to our admin team. And a process queue was developed inside of our church management software to where we were able to look at our dashboard and see how many first-time guests attended on a particular weekend. And there were certain times of the year where we tracked that a little bit better, obviously, inside of the month of August, inside of January, some of those higher attended months. But we had a very deliberate process and plan to follow up with anybody that was attending our church for the first time. And so, yeah, I think I think figuring out a way to where first-time guests can still remain anonymous, but you can capture their information. And another good thing is, we developed something called a newcomer suite as well. And so, somebody that was attending church for the first time, they could pop into that newcomer suite, and our pastors were there frequently to answer any questions that they might have about our children's ministry, or, we got theological questions, thrown at us, lobbed at us in those settings. And so I think creating those types of environments, inside of your church is paramount to ensuring, that first time guest, that they're captured, that their information is captured, but it's not enough just to capture it. You've got to follow up with that process, with a very healthy process in place too.
That's good. And if you're interested in some more best practices on that very topic, this past week I did an article on kind of that front door, back door conversation. And one of the things I shared were some best practices related to first time guests and tracking that. Ryan, a couple other kind of more technical questions on calculations. So we should be able to run through a couple of these pretty quickly. On the volunteers number, does that include inside and outside serving opportunities?
Absolutely. So that's every serving team that the church is creating or leading, it's going to include. So yeah, outreach and those weekend volunteer teams as well.
Yeah. And generally, how often are we looking for someone to serve for us to count them in the data that we're collecting?
Right. So with every church that we talk with, we specifically ask for the number of volunteers who serve at least one time per month. Yeah. That's the frequency that we're looking at.
And again, we're just trying to make it apples to apples so that you can compare where you are with other churches. And that's how we're setting that barometer. Some churches would say once a month, that's not near enough. Other churches would say, I'd give anything for people to serve at least once a month. But regardless of where you are on that spectrum, it helps us get to apples number. Similarly, I know churches look at average weekly attendance differently. Our numbers include what?
Everybody in the body with a heart, or I'm sorry, everybody in the building with a heartbeat.
With a heartbeat, yeah. Okay, good.
Every age from nursery to auditorium.
Yeah, so not just worship, a sanctuary attendance, but it includes kids, students, things like that too.
Right.
And then again, a clarification on this measuring staff. That's not just ministerial staff, right?
Correct. That's every paid individual who's paid out of the operating budget. That's contract musicians. That's some churches that pay for childcare workers during the weekend service. They pay for children's volunteers, which isn't really volunteer, I guess, if they're paid. If they are doing a role that is paid out of the operating budget of the church, they're included.
Okay. All right, very good. Now, here's the good news with all of that. If you missed all of that, if you missed all those details, don't worry.
Nope.
Because we include all of that in the ebook, Vital Signs, which you're going to get an email after we're finished today with a link so that you can download that. In that email, too, we'll also provide the replay of today's webinar because you might have friends and family that need to hear this. And so we want to make sure they get a chance to hear it as well. And then additionally, I mentioned the health assessment because one of the, let me just specifically address one of the other questions that came in was, what about churches that have been around for a while and they're looking for revitalization? Do you have something that would help with that too? And so here's the deal. The Unstuck Group, we serve churches of all different shapes and sizes. From churches in the less than 100 up to churches in the 10s, 20s, thousands, all different denominations, and new churches and churches that have been around for more than 100 years. And the reason why this works, you can tell I'm so excited about this. The reason why this works is we begin by asking the question, is the church healthy or not? And from that foundation, together, we're going to try to unpack where is God taking your ministry and what are the next steps to get there. And so the process that we're talking about, beginning with Vital Signs and that on-site ministry health assessment, it's for any church, whether it's a new church or one that's been around for many, many years. And you can learn more about that on-site ministry health assessment at theunstuckgroup.com. All right, Tammy, Blake, Kayla, Brian, Tiffany, and Mark in the background who you can't see, thank you all for participating in the conversation today. It's been fun.
It's been a blast.
Glad to be here.
Very much.
All right. And for those that have been participating from across the country and across the world, watch for that email. You're going to get some free stuff that your friends aren't going to get. So be watching for that email. And I'm sure we'll connect again sometime in the future on another webinar. Everybody have a great day.